This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with Brett Popplewell. He is an author and journalist who joined Carleton University's School of Journalism and Communication in 2017. His articles have been recognized by the National Magazine Awards Foundation in Best Short Feature, Profiles, Investigative Reporting, Longform Writing, and Sports and Travel. He has written for Bloomberg, Businessweek, Mother Jones, the Canadian Press, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Sportsnet, Maclean's, the Walrus, and more. He is the co-author of The Escapist, How One Man Cheated Death on the World's Highest Mountains, published in 2016. But today we will be talking about his latest book, Outsider, An Old Man, a Mountain, and the Search for a Hidden Past, published in 2023. Welcome, Brett.
Thanks for having me.
And I was telling Brett right before we came on that I just finished reading his book, and I really appreciate him being able to carve out time so quickly to chat with me about the book. So I had the privilege of seeing you at Eden Mills Writers Festival last September and picked up a copy of Outsider. As I said, I just read it, and full transparency, it was my best read of 2024 so far.
Ooh, I like that.
I really don't think anything will beat it. I'm confident of that. But for those who haven't read it yet, can you tell us a bit about it?
Of course, yeah. Well, I mean, we're getting to the end of 2024, so this is great when you say your favorite read thus far. And can I also just say, Eden Mills, like what a fantastic literary festival! It's like being in the Hobbit Shire. There, it was amazing. I absolutely loved it. The book. What can I tell you about it? So it's the story of this man. It's the true story of the most interesting and enigmatic human being I have met in my life. I'm a 41-year-old journalist. I've spent my career searching for interesting people with interesting stories to tell. That kind of quest has taken me to a lot of different corners of the world to report. And in 2015, I learned of this guy named Dag Obi, who lives in a school bus on the side of a ski hill, well, sort of on the side of a mountain, that a portion of it is a ski hill. He's very far away from the resort. And this man lived in a school bus, basically in the forest on the side of this mountain, and happened to be what was believed to be the world's oldest ultramarathon runner. And I was sort of listening to this tale as it was repeated to me. And I was asked if I would like to go and meet him to try and help capture a story of how he does this, how at the age of 75, which he was at that time, or maybe 74, how he managed to train his body to run 125 kilometers, an ultramarathon. I'm not sure what that is in miles, but it's about 24 hours of solid running. So I went out there to meet him, and very quickly, I became more fascinated actually by the question that seemed really the harder one to answer, which wasn't so much how he managed to do this, but why. Why did he live in the forest? Why did he live in a bus? Why did he live alone? Why was he living this lifestyle? And I started to probe around that question and asked him multiple different ways. And I thought I was starting to figure it out a little bit. And then I asked this question that really launched the book. And the question was, is there anything in this world that you wish you had? Because when I was with him on the side of this mountain and I was camping out in the frost and the snow, sub-zero weather to temperatures to try and sort of get to know how he lived, I was captured by how he didn't seem to care about possessions. And so when I asked him that simple question, is there anything that you wish that you had? He really threw me with his answer when he said, I wish I had a photograph of my mother. And as soon as he said that, I started to think, is there an answer? Does that sort of explain why he's living this sort of existence of kind of a bit of an alien, secluded and disassociated from society? So I asked him the follow-up, well, what do you know of your of your mother? And his answer was he knew that she was a Norwegian woman. And then the follow-up was obviously, well, what do you know about your father? And he said, I understand my father to have been a Nazi soldier. And so to go back to your question of sort of what can I tell you? Can I tell you a little bit about this book? It's sort of all of those things that I've just described. It's the story of this enigmatic man who lives, who's an extreme athlete, who once upon a time was the world's first extreme skier, who once upon a time was in movies like Goldfinger, who was this sort of dashing 1960s figure who transformed himself into it's an odd stereotype. It's not a perfect stereotype to say he's a hermit, but a man who lives a secluded life in the forest, runs day and night through blizzards and heat waves, and ultimately didn't really have a clear sense of where he had come from. Enter me on the quest to try and solve the mystery at the core of his existence.
Okay, that was a beautiful description of the book
Okay.
because it's so yeah, because it's so funny when I was reading it, before I started it, I sort of had an idea of where it was going to go, right? I honestly thought it would be about this old reclusive guy who maybe had some mental health issues and, I guess I was thinking very narrow in terms of what this book would turn out to be, and it explodes every expectation that I had because, as you said, he is an ultra well was a long distance runner. He had this life. I must tell you that I did not know anything about Lebensborn children, and everybody I've asked of all ages, no one knew about this. And even my mom is in her 80s; she didn't know about it. So I loved learning that piece of history as well, and I love to go down rabbit holes, so I've learned so much more as a result. But yes, this book, for anyone who's going to dive into it, it will blow your mind because it's not what you think it is. It's amazing.
I appreciate everything you just said because it's interesting that you, as a reader, that you believed that you understood where it was going to go. Because as the writer, I had no idea where it was going to go because I didn't know. And I've written this wasn't my first book, and now I'm working on this was my second book, and now I'm working on my third book. When I began those other two projects, I had a pretty clear sense of how the total story arc. This one, I didn't really know how it was going to end or what I was going to find. And the other thing that I would say is that the rabbit holes. I'm glad that you appreciated them because there are so many different rabbit holes because there's so many different elements of. It was kind of like writing about Forrest Gump a little bit, right? Like he's kind of drifting into so many different points of time in history, so many different he's running. He happens to become like an extreme runner right when like people start to run these Ironman and extreme marathons. He's an extreme skier right when skiing explodes. So I have to explain how skiing exploded, and then he's suspected to be a Lebensborn child, and then I had to explain that. I had a very basic understanding of the Lebensborn program when I came into this, and all that I really knew was I knew from the history of ABBA, the supergroup. I say supergroup, but maybe they're not a supergroup. Maybe they're just a disco group. Once upon a time, I had gone down some rabbit hole online where I had been reading about the band members of ABBA, and one of the band members, I believe her name is Annefrid, I think that's the one, was a Lebensborn child. And so she was not Swedish. She was Norwegian and had to flee Norway right after the war because it was not really a safe space for the children of that program, nor for the mothers.
Yeah, that's one of the rabbit holes I went down. I really was reading so much about it and the impact after the war and how people lived. And I read so many things that just, again, you opened the door to so many different areas because I also was researching DAG. I was looking at extreme skiing. I mean, skiing and then running. I just looked up so many things as a result of it. So I'm just going to warn people: make sure you have plenty of time because you'll want to look up all this information. It's amazing. So, but here's the question I'm really curious about because over time, you clearly developed a very close relationship with DAG, especially well, I'll talk a little bit more about his family of origin, and I wondered if maintaining a journalist's objectivity was difficult, or if, with a character like him, it was to be expected that you would develop a relationship.
It's a good question. And I mean, objectivity and journalistic objectivity is something that I always find myself trying to explain to my students because I'm a journalism professor. And So I'll just maybe start with the way that I really sort of view the term. A lot of people see objectivity in journalism as you are to have no bias, come down the middle, and really sort of have no, your opinion shouldn't really have a place in the story that you're telling. When I first became a journalist and I studied journalism before I became a practicing journalist, that was very much my understanding of it as well. I have since come to understand how the concept originated, which was really pulled from the sciences, where you would approach a story or you would approach a subject with, and you would approach it using this scientific method of objectivity as like a way to probe and test theories to try and figure out what stands up against scrutiny. And so that's very much sort of my understanding of it now, and my use of it now is like I go into every story accepting like I am a human. I come into this with biases. Some of them I am aware of. Some of them I am not aware of. And so I don't shy away from that in my work anymore. I believe objectivity is crucial to journalism, but I don't see it as this view from nowhere. I see it more as you use this method to figure out what stands up. With this particular story, I'd say there was two things that I sort of encountered early on that made it really difficult for me to find my way as the journalist in it. And one was that Dag, he is a magnificently like fascinating person who tells his story in a way that he understands it, but it's not the same way that everyone around him understands it. And so in that way, he became to me an unreliable narrator. And I say that not meaning that he was lying to me or misleading me or intentionally trying to lead me astray, but more that I think that the questions that I was posing, he didn't have answers to them that could really be checked out factually, but he had interpretations of what had happened to him that had ultimately become his truth and his understanding of his story. So as I proceeded through the reporting, there were clear moments where my understanding of what had happened and what had transpired was different from his. And my understanding was based off of reporting and research that I had done with him and also with the other people who were present. And so then I had this issue where I was trying to make a square out of two things that were circular or something. Like it's just they didn't quite fit together. And then in the middle of all of this as well, to your point, like I wasn't prepared journalistically and just prepared, I guess, mentally and emotionally myself to for the fact that this would become an extremely personal journey for the both of us. I set out to try and help a man figure out who his mother was and find a photograph of her, thinking that is quite the mystery and will make for an interesting story if he's willing to let me share it at the end. I didn't sort of think through or hadn't sort of contemplated all the ways that journey would actually be so personal. Like this is the relationship between someone and their mother is kind of I think it's kind of the most important relationship in our lives. And so it made it so that like we're on this journey of discovery together, and it's filled with emotions, and because of that, like this friendship just forms between us, and it was natural. I think that we were always I had a respect for him, and I think that he had a respect for me, like a professional respect in sort of what I was doing. But I kept coming back to him. I kept going back. I live to readers who aren't familiar with Canadian geography, I live kind of north of, I don't know what is directly south. Like I'm kind of north of New York, right? Like we're sort of on that side of the country, and he lives kind of north of like Washington State. Like we're very far away from each other. So and he doesn't have a phone, and he doesn't have email. So if I ever had any questions for him, I would have to get on a plane and fly out to see him and spend time with him. So I did that over and over and over and over again, and it became, it's almost like jumping on a plane to go visit your friend, which is what it very much became. So I definitely crossed that sort of threshold with him, where I became closer to him than I have to really anybody I've ever written about. And then the complication, of course, for me as the writer becomes, well, my ultimate loyalty in the writing of the book is not to Dag, it's to the book and to the piece of journalism that I am producing, which in the end is very complicated if you realize that you're going to write things that check out factually, and but they are things that he would perhaps prefer not to be in the text. That's sort of that slow when I realized I was in that territory, I started to move very slowly because I was trying to think through my every sort of action and making sure that what I was doing would hold up to the scrutiny of, like, if I was looking at this just as another journalist and trying to analyze this as a piece of work, does this check out factually, or is this just Dag's telling of his life story? Because in the end, this is not a memoir. It's a little bit memoir because it's a little bit of memoir from me, but it's biography of Dag. So there's, like, my interpretations in there are present.
So when did you physically start to actually write the book? And then, so did you start kind of as you were meeting him, because it was over a course of years that you were telling his story? So when did it sort of start?
So I first met Dag in November of 2015. I think it was like November, it was around November 20th or so of 2015. And at that moment in time, on my first encounter, I was actually carrying around camera equipment, like lighting and stuff, because I was attached with the photo editor at Sportsnet magazine was the person who had originally told me about Dag. And he told me about Dag because he had met Dag in this 125-kilometer death race where he just was running and he saw this guy who looked like Jesus if Jesus had grown old, because that's kind of what Dag looks like, and thought, this guy is very different from the rest of us because he's 3 times our age. So he had planted himself in this photo editor's mind. His name is Miles. And so Miles was the one who first told me about Dag and wanted me to come with him to meet him to try and work on what might have become a documentary. So I was with Miles and another fellow named Derek Frankowski, who's a filmmaker out in British Columbia. So that's 2015. I was also sort of I've always been a magazine writer, so I started thinking of it as a magazine piece as well, up until about 2017. And I had been liaising with Dag, trying to, when I had nothing else to do, I would poke around some archives and try and see what I could find about his mom. And he would reach out to me because he when he's not living this secluded life, he runs down into the nearest town and picks up the weekend newspaper. And sometimes I would be in it with a story that I'd written. And so he would read it and he would call me to say what he thought of the most recent thing that I wrote. And so that was sort of the relationship up until 2017, when I proposed a different book to my editors at my editor at HarperCollins. And that book was a business book idea. It was sort of like a Michael Lewis kind of, The Big Short kind of idea, but wrapped around the marijuana industry that was emerging. And that book didn't get picked up. It sort of made the rounds around all the publishing houses, and no one sort of jumped at it as something that they thought would find an audience. So I was a little bit dejected, and my editor at HarperCollins reached out. And I was living in Toronto at that time, and we lived near to each other. And she just said, "Let's just go for a walk and talk, and try and talk through what your next book might be." And so we were walking through this neighborhood in Toronto called Riverdale, and she was asking me, what I'd like to do next. And I was like, I don't know. I thought I knew. I thought it was the book that I just proposed to you that nobody wants. And she said, "Well, who's the most interesting person that you've met in your travels as a journalist who you think might become a book? Who's the most interesting person that you can think of?" And I just started telling her the story of this guy, about Dag, this guy who I had met, who lives on the side of a mountain, and he was in Goldfinger. He was the world's first extreme skier. He might be its oldest ultramarathon runner, and trying to help him find his mom. And he thinks he might be a Lebensborn child. And I sort of, in my memory, I mean, this is how I retell this story. So, if if you went and interviewed her, she might tell it differently. But in my memory, I sort of found myself kind of walking alone for a second because she had sort of stopped and was kind of processing everything that I was saying. And she basically told me, like, I think that's it. I think like, that might be, like, that's quite the story that you're telling. And so that was 2017. And so I think it was winter time. I think it was the start of 2017. And I reached back out to Dag to let him know, like, there's, like, my publisher is interested in turning your life story and having me write your life story, and to try and write about this quest that I've sort of been on to try and help solve this mystery. And I didn't want to just sort of sign him up for it without sort of discussing it with him. But we had to sort of discuss how, it would be my book. It wouldn't be his book, because I would need to, I just don't think I could have written the book in his voice. Like, I just did. It was, so I needed to discuss with him how it would look at the other end, like who would have ultimate control over the book, and would it be interesting to him. And he took a little bit of time with it. He was very surprised that, like, that someone would think that his life would be a book. He had sort of dreamed and aspired to write a book, as I think a lot of people do, but he didn't really think that his story would be like a mass market book. And then he called me back and said, sure. So then that brought us to sort of May 2017. And that was when I really started in on it. And so I went to visit him, 15 times over the course of the next several years. To every sort of few months, I would go fly across the country and meet him in different parts of the year to do the reporting on this book. And it took up until it was 2019 when I thought I could start writing the book to hand it in. And I did try. I submitted the first draft of the book, and as I sort of touched on before, the book is a little bit of memoir from me. The first draft of the book wasn't really very much memoir from me. The first draft of the book was really more the story of Dag as told by Dag, and it didn't really work. My editor at that time gave me the manuscript back, and she said what I sort of needed to hear was, like, this is going to be a special book. We're in really good shape, but we need to kind of change everything. we need to put you into the text. And the reason why she said that was, she said the questions that you are posing are driving this narrative more so than the answers that he is able to provide. And so you need to be in the text to be asking those questions and drive it forward. And of course, at that point, I had also, I had brought him, not sort of brought him online, but I had helped him to get the documentation that he would need to actually get home to where he came from. When I first met him, he did not have the documentation that he would need, like a passport. He's not a Canadian citizen, so he would need a Norwegian passport in order to travel. He didn't have one. He also didn't have, like, a permanent residency card in Canada so that he could legally get back. So I'd sort of work to help him get those documents so that he could come with me to Norway, because I had concluded that in order to really try and solve this mystery, we would have to go back to where he had come from. And of course, to try and write that part of the book without being in it is, like, impossible to try to do that, because I'm very much in that chunk of the text.
Yeah, I remember at Eden Mills, you talked about how your editor sort of said you need to insert yourself into the story more. And I thought that was beautifully done. And it wasn't, I don't want to say too much. It wasn't, like, overwhelming. It was just the right touch to pull that whole story together and the meaningfulness of it. So kudos to her for saying that and having you sort of rewrite it, I guess. But yeah, that part was really meaningful.
It's difficult to pull off in the right way, the right balance. And I think a lot of journalists do fail when they put themselves into their stories, because, and I mean, a lot of journalists succeed, but the risk of doing it is you turn the lens onto you for kind of too long, and the story becomes about you, and it becomes kind of like catharsis, your own catharsis, and it loses its focus. I always, when I write works of journalism, I try to write it without me in it. And if I need to be in it, I will put myself in the first draft, and then I'll usually try and figure out if the story will stand up without me present, and then sort of remove myself later. This was the opposite, where I was sort of putting myself in more and more as I went sort of through the drafts. One of the things that I needed to deal with as soon as I put myself in the book was I needed to be honest with the readers as to why this journey really mattered to me. Why did I take this on? Because like why not everybody would sort of hear someone say, "Oh, I wish I had a photograph of my mother," and then make that their thing. And so I ultimately I sort of found myself having to disclose elements of my own relationship with my own family, with my own mother, who of course is in the book, and my father as well, and these mysteries that were in my background, and sort of failed searches that I had been on in my own past to try and locate grave sites for people who I never knew, who I thought their brief lives and mysterious deaths had impacted my own life. So I had to sort of juggle with that stuff, which I had never spoken about publicly. And then all of a sudden, I'm doing it in the most public way that I could possibly do it, which is putting it in my own book.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was this beautiful sort of subtext that ran through the entire story, and it just gave it more like a depth that, again, I was not expecting, to be honest. I wasn't expecting it. So now I do have to ask, when you said to Dag that you wanted to help him find his this photo of his mother, did you know you were going to ask that, or did you just sort of blurt it out and then you were now committed to this thing that you wanted to do?
I mean, I thought about it pretty quickly, I guess. Like it was in the same trip that I sort of started to try and think through how I could do that. I mean, I am a trained investigative reporter. I mean, all sort of journalism of any sort of quality is investigative by nature, right? But I was once upon a time a member of the Toronto Star's investigative team. And then when I became a sports writer, I wasn't sort of a traditional sports writer in that I don't really sit and watch sports all day. I'm not really fascinated by the minutia of the games, but I am fascinated by the stories of people who are doing pretty intense things with their bodies and kind of doing so at the detriment of kind of the rest of their lives. And so I had this sense that I might be able to solve this by just doing what I always do, which is try and do archival research and try and uncover rocks and just keep asking questions and trying to find little nuggets of facts that I keep saying facts instead of truth, but I'm trying to find little nuggets of facts, little facts that kind of would help to fill in the portrait of who she was. I did not know that I would ever be able to get a photograph of her, but I did believe that if I did my work well, that I could kind of paint a portrait of her based off of the facts that I gathered. Did I know that I was signing up to a multi-year journey when I took this on? Not at all. Not at all. I didn't realize the difficulty that there'd be in trying to track these kinds of records. And the other thing too is that at the time when I started, I'm not even sure that I was really conscious of the DNA sort of ancestry, DNA and 21andMe. Like I don't know that, I'm not sure where those sort of were in their own sort of history of those tools, but they weren't sort of on my radar that I can remember. And if they were on my radar, it would have been something that I would have seen it as sort of like a bit of a last resort kind of. I think that all of these things can generally be solved. Well, not all of them, but a lot of this stuff can be solved by just archival work with whatever you can, if you can find, if you know where to go and can find the people to help you in those spaces, then you can generally find the the answers to your questions.
Well, that's what's so funny. As a retired librarian, I one of my favorite parts of the job always was research. But my question for you though is, as a journalist, do you have access to resources the rest of us don't? Because it
Mm.
was amazing when that whole journey of you working with Dag to locate his family of origin, his mother, that was phenomenal. The amount of footwork you had to do. And I just wondered, because of your background, was that sort of an easier process than it would be, say, for somebody like me who has general knowledge, but not to the level you have?
I think that you might have more knowledge than me on really how to navigate like anything, any archive. No, like, being a journalist doesn't really open doors. It's not like there's some secret web that we can access. It's I guess I've just been trained to, if there's a question that I have, like who was Dag's mother, the first questions that I would sort of pose is like, well, what do you understand? What was her name? And then when was she born? And what do you understand of where she died? And then to go backwards from that to then try and see, well, where does she pop up anywhere? I would go into census data. I've done enough of this that I know, like, there's an interesting book that I read years ago about how little we really know about Shakespeare. And basically all we really know about Shakespeare is like that a few times in his life he had to go somewhere and his presence was documented by the state. Like, and he doesn't always sign his name the same way. So I've sort of always thought of that. Like, there's little points in time in your life when the government or somebody, you have to file something with them, and it becomes accessible to the rest of us. So that's, your birth certificate, your death certificate. If you're married, that becomes logged. Census data, those are easy hits if you can find them. And then adoption records too. So I sort of started there, and then the other things I look for is there's sort of these registries, right, of sort of who's living where. And so you can sort of figure out, like, and from what year to what year someone lived in a certain residence. And these are all things that historians do when they're trying to put a little blue plaque on a building, right? Like, figure out when did Charles Dickens really live here? They'll go back and sort of check. The churches if you're dealing with things 100 years ago, the church records are often important resources to go to. But it proved difficult because the information that Dag had, he didn't have his mother's name right. He had her name, he was close. And I can't remember, it would be in the book. I can't remember what he thought her name was, but it wasn't, he had her last name right. And he knew what his biological name was. And so because of that, I knew, like, well, his mother or his father's real last name was Hansen. So then, of course, Hansen in Norway, it's like Johnson in North America. Like, there's a lot of them. Yeah, it's just I'm always fascinated by just the trail, like, just trying to, like, any little fact that I gather, it kind of opens up like 10 more questions. Like, so I gotta try and narrow down different things by just sort of whatever question emerges in my mind. I never shy away from asking the question, either to myself or to someone else, or and I think that's the trick.
Yeah.
There is no sort of database, the secret database that I can access.
Well, I just have to say, my grandmother lived in this house that is about to be torn down, sadly. And my mother, the family always assumed my grandmother was like the second person to own this house or whatever. Well, I did the research, and I found out 11 other families had lived in that home before my grandmother bought it and lived in it for many years. And people were kind of blown away by the research. But I love research, and I love pouring through old records. And that's why I thought the journey you went on was absolutely, that again was a part of what was so fascinating to me, how you kept digging and digging. And again, and I know, old records that were written down were often written misspelled. And so there's that whole other component that people don't normally know, but there's that whole other piece of it that people have to understand when they're doing really serious research.
And I made mistakes as I went along, and that slowed me down. So I have a master's in history. I don't have a PhD. I went straight from doing my master's to just becoming a full-time journalist. But when I was doing my master's, we had to do it was a thesis, dissertation, and for that the whole objective of the project was to train us how to do archival research, to search for primary documents and primary sources. So I guess some of that came into effect. But interesting, one of my friends from school, who then went on, she did her PhD, and now she's a professor of history at the University of Glasgow. She read the book, and she reached out and she was like, "Well, you're an idiot. You you made a rookie error in that you were searching too narrow of a time for the date of birth for the father. That because in the end I kept getting nothing, 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 and then made this discovery when I realized that his name was spelt differently in two different places, and if I changed the spelling of the name, then I could find him, but I still wasn't getting what I wanted because I was searching for like a certain year, like 1891 or something, and I needed to search sort of a 5 year window, and she said that like that's you should know that you should know that you need to broaden the search and then narrow it, and so yeah, it's all these things like I've picked up this sort of training, I guess, from different places, different in different ways.
Well, I want to switch a little bit, and I just want to mention that I read your recent article published by the Walrus titled The Strange Theft of a Priceless Churchill Portrait, the inside story of one of Canada's most brazen, baffling, and mysterious art heists and how the police cracked it. And I have to tell you, I'm a huge Karsh fan. I have been since I was in high school. And so I loved this article. It was absolutely fascinating. I didn't even know that portrait or that picture hung there and that it had gone missing. So for anyone, please read this article. It's amazing. And I just wondered sort of how journal articles come about. Are you presented with subjects to research and write, or do you pitch ones that grab your attention? Like, how did that come about, that one?
I'm glad you read that story. That was why I was a little slow getting back to you last week because there was a lot of news breaking on that one. I That story was a pitch that I proposed that to the magazine, and it was a while ago that I actually pitched them that idea. I thought it was a strange case that had a so the portrait. It's a portrait of Winston Churchill. It's called the Roaring Lion. It's the most one of the most famous photographs of all time. And when it was stolen from the Chateau Laurier, which is this like it's basically a castle in Ottawa, right next to Parliament Hill, where I live in Ottawa and I grew up in Ottawa. When the portrait was stolen, there was a media frenzy about it, or when it was discovered stolen, because a thief lifted the portrait and put a forgery up, and then 8 months later, the forgery was discovered. So it was like, oh no, where could the real one be? That was August 2022 when the forgery was discovered. Lots of media attention, and then absolutely nothing. And so then I entered into this. I think I pitched the story in January 2023 to the magazine, and I wanted to. I didn't think I could find it, but I wanted to report on what had been lost, why it mattered, and the chances of getting it back. And so that was my proposal to them. And yeah, I got the commission pretty quick, and then of course took forever to pull it together. I had that story ready to go earlier this year, and with stories that go in the Walrus, and it would be the same with the New Yorker and other magazines of sort of a certain caliber. They all have to go through a fact check. So a fact checker goes back and makes sure that my reporting stands up. And the fact checker was checking the story and got tipped by one of my sources who I hadn't spoken to in a while that they actually found the portrait. And so then it's like, whoa, we had the inside, we had advanced notice. No one else knew. But so then I came back out to try and confirm it. And the details were just too vague for us to run with it to say that it had been found. So that story that you read, the benefit of it is, or the privileged position, I guess, that we were in that the Walrus was in, and I was in as the magazine writer, was that I had done all this research well in advance of last week when it was finally announced that they had found the portrait and made an arrest. I was sitting on a 5,000 word story, and then I just added 1,000 words on the end of it of how this was done, and then we were able to produce what I think is the definitive read on on what is the most scandalous art heist in 21st century Canada. So that story was my own proposal, my own pitch. I find that I probably do. I used to pitch more. I almost sort of I've never been 100% working on my own ideas. I've always done ideas that are presented to me as well. I used to pitch more, and I would end up chasing my own stories more. And now I pitch a little bit less, just because I don't know if I'm tired. I don't know why, but I find that it's probably about 50-50 now. So there's two magazine stories that I've been picking away at. One of them was the car story. That was my own pitch. I've got another investigation on the go with another magazine. That was they came after they came to me with the idea. I recently proposed a book, two book ideas to my publishers, and they then proposed another book idea back to me, and I'm doing their idea first. So that's sort of how it goes. It's again, it's a very privileged position as well to have publishers and editors asking you to chase their ideas too, because then it's not all on me as the writer to find the next big story for me to do.
Yeah. Speaking of, you've got some things coming up. I just wondered if you can mention the book you're currently working on. And I'm so excited because I am definitely going to go back and read The Escapist, because one of the things I absolutely love are mountain climbing kind of stories. So I cannot wait to read that. But can you talk about what you're working on?
Yeah, I think so. So I'm glad you mentioned The Escapist, because if you think of Outsider as the story of an extreme person with like a mystery to it, and there's like passion, but it's bordering on obsession, and etc. That is very much the themes of The Escapist as well, which is the story of a mountain climber who, when I first met him, he had just survived a Taliban attack in Pakistan on the world's eighth highest mountain. So, and the story there is really, it's more of a sort of a spiritual journey of a guy who's trying to ultimately, he's dealing with a lot of trauma and PTSD from having lost friends on all these climbs, and survived a massacre. And the question at the heart of his life is like, why have I survived where other people have died? And so it's very much a fatalist journey. So that's that story. That's that book. And then Outsiders kind of thematically similar. And I'd say that those two books really come out of my background as a sports writer, who also was doing a lot of profile work. But the other side of what I've been as a journalist professionally is an investigative reporter. And more recently, my magazine work has been true crime, a lot of true crime stories. And so I proposed another book along the lines of these sort of extreme stories of survival, which I aspire to do as like my fourth book. But the next book that I'm working on is a true crime story. Ooh. And it's a story that has been written about, and it's been in like Netflix kind of 1 hour documentaries, but it hasn't been done into a full length book. And it is the story of the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist.
I'm in. 100% in.
So,
we're already in.
And what I aspire to do with that book is to, I'm deep into it now, and I'm starting to travel for it and going to speak to a lot of sources on it. Is like, I hope that it has as much depth and takes readers to the same extreme places as Outsider did. There might not be any Lebensborn in it, but there is, and the Nazis won't necessarily be in the text, but there will be, early French settlers in Canada, and Indigenous peoples, and the history of this product that is such a big deal up here that we put. It is our flag. It's a maple leaf. So yeah, and it is one of the biggest agricultural heists of all time. So
wow. Okay, so I don't really know anything about it, so I really am looking forward to it. I don't know if this is the right term for it, but I love creative nonfiction. The nonfiction that just, you learn something you didn't know, and it's written in such a compelling way that you have to tell everyone about it. And I will tell you, that is how I felt about Outsider. I feel that will be how The Escapist is. And then your next book, which, can you give us an idea of when it might publish? I know that's really hard to say, but.
I'm working on it now. I think it's going to be a lot easier than the last An Outsider was. I do not anticipate it taking 5 years. I'm hoping that we're out in market in the next 2 years. It takes a bit of time for them to put it together once I submit it to them, but I'm trying to meet all my deadlines, and I should have a full draft within a year.
Excellent. Well, Brett, I hope that you'll come back and chat with me after I've read that one as well. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here. You've answered my questions and you've talked about something that, again, like I said, 2024, this has been my best book, Outsider. And I just thank you so much for writing it. It was such a beautiful, compelling story.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for coming to Eden Mills, and thank you for reading the book and sharing it with others. This has been really great for me because this evening I'm on a public stage with a radio host from the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, talking to the CBC's book club. So this is a good. I'm sure the questions that you posed, the answers that I got here, it's good. It's got me thinking for tonight. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and have a great time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.